Chapter 7. Spain under Abdurrahman III. Abdurrahman III and Nasser Lidanillah, 912 to 961, may be looked upon as the Solomon of the Spanish sultans, succeeding to the throne when he was quite a youth, to the exclusion of his uncles, the sons of the late sultan. He found the country torn by innumerable factions, and the king's power openly defied by rebels, Arab, Berber, and Christian. In person and through his generals, he put down all these rebels, and though not uniformly successful against the Christians in the north, yet he defeated them in a series of great engagements. He welded all the discordant elements under his rule into one great whole, thereby giving the Arab domination in Spain another lease of life. In 929, he took the title of Emir al-Mu'minin, or Commander of the Faithful. His alliance was sought by the Emperor of the East, and he treated on equal terms with the Emperor of Germany and the King of France. To this great king, with more truth than to his namesake, Abdurrahman II, may be applied the words of Miss Yonge. He was of that type of Eastern monarch that seemed molded on the character of Solomon, large-hearted, wise, magnificent, tolerant, and peaceful. He was as great a contrast to the stern, ascetic, narrow-minded, but earnest Alfonso or Ramiro, as were the exquisite horseshoe arches, filigree stonework, lattices, inlaid jewelry of marble pavements, and slender minarets, to their dark vault-like, low-browed churches, and solid castles built out of hard, unmanageable granite. We find in this king none of that suspicious jealousy which we saw in Muhammad, even though Omar, the arch-rebel and Christian renegade, still held out at Bobastro when he ascended the throne, and his treatment of Christians was, throughout his reign, tolerant and politic. But his claims in this respect will be best seen from a very interesting fragment that has come down to our own times, describing the embassy of a certain John of Gors, a monk from an abbey near Metz, who carried letters from Otho, Emperor of Germany, to the Spanish Sultan. In 950, Abdurrahman had sent an embassy to the emperor. A bishop who had been at the head of this embassy died, and this seems to have caused a delay in the answer. As the caliph's letter contained blasphemies against Christ, it was determined to write a reply in the king's name, such as might perhaps convince Abdurrahman of the error of his ways. A certain bishop, Aldeburo, was appointed to be at the head of the return embassy, and he asks the abbot of the monastery of Gors to give him 2 assistants. 2 are chosen, but one of these quarrels with his superior and is expelled from the body, whereupon John offers himself as a substitute. The abbot only gives his consent to John's going with great reluctance, knowing that the young monk had an ardent longing to be a martyr, if he could only get the opportunity. Going through Lyon and by ship to Barcelona, the ambassadors reached the frontier town Tortosa, and at last got to Cordova, where they were assigned a house 2 miles from the palace, and, though well entertained, were informed to their dismay that as the Moorish ambassadors had been made to wait 3 years for an answer, Otho's messengers would have to wait 9 years. Moreover, they now discovered that the king had been already apprised of the contents of the letter which Otho had sent by a comrade of the late ambassador bishop, whom John and his companions had taken with them to Barcelona. The king employs Hasdai, a Jew, as his go-between, who warns them not to divulge the contents of the letter, as it would make them liable to punishment. For the letter contained what Muslims would consider blasphemy against their prophet. Soon after this, John, the Bishop of Cordova, is sent to them to suggest that they should carry their gifts to the king and say nothing of the letter. But John of Gores stoutly refused to do this, saying that the delivery of the letter was his chief duty, and that as Abdurrahman had begun by reviling Christ, he must not be surprised at Otho's retaliating against Muhammad. However, John of Cordova begs him to remember the position in which the Christians stood, under pagan rule. "We are forbidden," he said, "by the apostle, to resist the powers that be. In our calamity, we have this one consolation: we are allowed to observe our own laws and rights, and our rulers, if they see us diligent in our religion, honor us, cherish us, and delight in our society, while they abhor the Jews. As our religion then suffers no harm at their hands, let us obey the Muslims in other things." The bishop was anxious, therefore, that the letter should be suppressed, as calculated to do harm to the Christian community and no good to Otho. His advice, however, fell on deaf ears. The monk of Gores was resolved on doing what he deemed his plain duty, nor was he content to forego his chance of martyrdom, though his action might entail disastrous consequences on the Christians subject to the Moors. He taunted the bishop with giving his advice from a fear of man: "Better to die of hunger than eat the salt of unbelievers," and expressed horror at the fact that the bishop was circumcised, and also abstained from certain meats in deference to Muslim scruples. It was in vain that the bishop pointed out that otherwise they could not live with the Saracens. John of Gores now expressed his intention of delivering the letter forthwith, but the king denied the ambassadors an audience, leaving them to themselves for 6 or 7 weeks. Early in 955, however, the king sent to them and asked if they held firm to their previous resolve, and on receiving an answer in the affirmative, he threatened all the Christians in his dominions with loss of privileges and even death. John of Gores merely answers that the guilt would be on the king's head, but the latter is persuaded to milder counsels by his advisers, who remind him of Otho's power and the certainty that he would interfere in favor of his ambassadors. John of Gores now proposes the only practicable course: that Abdurrahman should send a fresh embassy to Otho and ask for instructions for his ambassadors under the circumstances. Recommundus, a Christian, offers to go as ambassador if a vacant bishopric be given him as reward. He sets out and reaches Gores in February 956. Otho gives him a fresh letter with instructions to suppress the former one, to conclude an alliance with the Sultan, and make an arrangement with him for putting down the brigands who infested the marches. Leaving Gores with Dudo, the emperor's legate, on March 30, he reached Cordova on June 1st, but the Sultan declined to receive the second comers till he had received the earlier embassy. So after 3 years' semi-captivity, John is released and told to prepare himself for the king's presence by shaving, washing, and putting on new apparel. He declines to go in any otherwise than he is, and even when the king, thinking his refusal due to poverty, sends him a sum of money, the monk accepts the gift and distributes it to the poor, but says he will only see the king as a poor monk. The king good-naturedly said, "Let him come as he likes." On June 21st, 956, the ambassadors were conducted to the king's presence along a road thronged with sightseers. The steps of the palace were laid down with tapestry, and a guard of honor lined both sides of the approach. On John's entrance, the king, as a great mark of distinction, gave him his open palm to kiss, and beckoned him to a seat near his own couch. After a silence, Abdurrahman apologized to the monk for the long delay which he had been obliged to impose on the embassy, and which was in no sense due to disrespect for John himself, whose virtue and wisdom he could not but acknowledge. As a proof that this was no mere empty compliment, the king expressed his readiness to give him whatever he asked. John's wrath vanishes at these gracious words, and they talk amicably together. But when the monk asks leave to depart, Abdurrahman says, "After waiting so long to see one another, shall we part so soon?" He suggests that they should have at least 3 interviews. At their next meeting, they discourse on the respective power of the empires of Otho and the Caliph himself, and the Sultan, taught by the experience of Spain, points out the unwisdom of allowing feudal subjects to become too powerful by dividing kingdoms between them. So ends this unique and interesting fragment, which throws so pleasant a light on the character and the court of the greatest of Spanish sultans, and proves that the Christians at that time enjoyed considerable freedom and even honor at the hands of the Muslim government. The reason why the king was unwilling to receive the first letter brought by John was not so much because he was reluctant to read words against Muhammad, as because he would by so doing render himself liable to the penalty of death, which was ordained by any law to any Muslim, king or slave, who listened to abuse of the Prophet without exacting summary vengeance from the blasphemer. But, and here was the king's dilemma, he could not punish the ambassadors without incurring the enmity of Otho. The only possible alternative was that suggested by John, that Otho should be asked to withdraw the objectionable letter without the Sultan having officially read it, and this Abdurrahman adopted. The moderation of the king is conspicuous throughout, for we must regard the threat against the Christians as merely a threat, never really intended to be put into execution. in showing tolerance towards their Christian subjects, the Spanish caliphs might be thought to have forgotten the traditions of Islam. But, as a matter of fact, Muhammad seems to have been very inconsistent in his views with regard to Christians and Jews at different times of his career, and while he enjoined the necessity of holy wars, he permitted the people of the book to be admitted to tribute. In one passage, he even seems to allow the possibility of salvation to Jews, Christians, and Sabians. Verily they who believe, and those who Judaize, and the Sabians, and the Christians, whoever of these believeth in God and the last day, and doeth that which is right, there shall come no fear on them, neither shall they be grieved. And there is one remarkable text to find in the mouth of Muhammad: let there be no violence in religion. Moreover, some of the best Mohammedan rulers that have ever lived upheld the same principle of toleration. Abbas II, one of the Persian Sufis, is reported to have said, "It is for God, not for me, to judge of men's consciences, and I will never interfere with what belongs to the tribunal of the great Creator and Lord of the universe." Again, Akbar, one of the greatest kings that ever lived, followed in practice the principle thus expressed by his minister Abu Fazul. Persecution, after all, defeats its own ends. It obliges men to conceal their opinions, but produces no change in them. Noble sentiment, surely, and such as we would expect from the followers of Christ rather than Muhammad. Yet far too often have portions of the Christian church been conspicuous for intolerance rather than tolerance. Al-Ándalus, indeed, does say in his letter to Aquila, Bishop of Winchester, that he does not approve of punishing heresy with death, because God, by the mouth of his prophet, had said, "I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn away from his way and live." But Al-Ándalus was a man of unusual mildness and sweet reasonableness, as his letters to Felix and al-Ândalus testify. On the other hand, there were too many frantic bigots in the church, like Arnold of Ceuta, whose impious words, in connection with the massacre of Albigensians, are not likely to be forgotten. "Slay all, God will know his own." In fact, so opposed did the Christian spirit come to be to the Mohammedan in this respect, that their toleration was made a principal argument against the Moors by the Archbishop of Valencia in his memorial to Philip III at the end of the 16th century. A very melancholy instance of bigotry and intolerance is afforded by Bernard, a French monk, who was made Archbishop of Toledo by Alfonso on the capture of that city in 1085. By the Treaty of Capitulation, certain mosques had been expressly reserved to the Muslims, just in the same way as certain churches had been reserved for Christians by Musa in 712. But Bernard, by way of showing his zeal in the cause of God, in defiance of the king's plighted word, chose to perform Mass in their chief mosque. Alfonso was furiously angry when he heard of his archbishop's proceedings, but the Muslims, with wonderful forbearance, seeing that the king had not authorized Bernard's outrageous conduct, came forward of their own accord and begged him to pardon the act, and even voluntarily surrendered their mosque. Not only were the Christians allowed to practice their religion, but even as we have seen above, encouraged it. Al-Mansur, the champion of Islam, allowed his Christian servants to rest on Sundays. Christians in every reign held high posts at court and throughout the land, and not only time-serving Christians, but men like Samson and Leovigild, who were known to sympathize with the party of zealots, were employed by the king to write letters to and negotiate with the neighboring kings. This was no doubt due to their general trustworthiness, their quickness, and their knowledge of Arabic as well as Latin. Among the great functionaries of state, there was one who held the office of Kitabatu di Damon, which, being interpreted, is the office of protection. The Christians and Jews were under his general jurisdiction and were called the people of the protection. But besides this Arab, Secretary of State for the Christians, the latter had their own counts, a relic of the Gothic system, who, however, did not always stand up for their interests. There were also Christian censors, but it is not known what position they held in state. The young Christian cadets of noble birth were brought up at court, and numbers of Sclavonian Christians served in the king's bodyguard, of whom under Hakem I, 796 to 822, there were 2,000. All things considered, it is a matter for surprise that these two people, so unlike in race, habits, prejudices, and religion, lived so comparatively quietly, side by side, in spite of a perpetual state of warfare between the Arabs and the Christians in the north, which tended to keep alive the animosities of the two races in that part of Spain, which was under Mohammedan rule. Moreover, the pride of race was very strong in the pure-blooded Arabs. Thus the poet Said Ahmed Dujad, in a poem called The Battle of the Town, Polé, boasts that the conquerors are of the pure race of Adnan and Catan, without any foreign admixture, while he calls the defeated Spaniards miscreants, followers of a false faith, sons of the pale faces. The haughty Arabs, in fact, were too prone to look upon all the Spaniards, both renegades and Christians, as mere canille, or simply the masses. But in spite of this, the races to a certain extent amalgamated, and Eulogius's endeavors to prove that, but for the outbreak of fanaticism in the middle of the 9th century, this amalgamation would have had serious results for Christianity in Spain. The Arabs did not disdain to seek the alliance of the free Christian states, nor were the latter averse from doing the same when political occasion demanded it. As early as 798, the Walis of the frontier cities sought to make themselves independent by what the Arab writer describes as vile policy and unworthy acts, i.e., by seeking the friendship of the Christian kings, and there are many instances of these kings asking for aid, even servilely, from Arab princes. Again, as was inevitable from the nature of the case, intermarriages were common between the two races. The example was early set by the widow of Roderick, the last Gothic king, marrying Abdulaziz, son of Musa, The sons of Witiza also married Arab women, and Sarah, the daughter of one of these princes, was the progenitrix of a noble family of Arabs, one of her descendants being the historian Ibn al-Khattuya, which means son of the Gothic princess. Abdurrahman an-Nasir, the greatest of all the Spanish sultans, was the son of a Christian slave named Maria, and the mighty al-Mansur had for grandmother the daughter of a renegade Christian. These are some instances, but it is not necessary to dwell on what was so common an occurrence as intermarriage between the peoples, and is forbidden by neither the Quran nor the Bible. However, there is one point in this connection which deserves a more particular notice. The intermingling of the races has been supposed to have been facilitated, in part, by the yearly tribute of 100 maidens, paid by the northern kings to the earlier Arab sultans. Modern historians mostly throw doubt upon the story, saying that of the early historians, none mention it, and that the Arabs do not even allude to it. But if Condé is to be trusted, an Arab writer does speak of it, as of a thing well known, in a letter of Omar ibn al-Haftas al-Mudaffar, king of Algarve, to Alfonso VI in 1086, occur the words, "Do thou remember the time of Muhammad al-Mansur, and bring to thy mind those treaties wherein thy forefathers offered him the homage even of their own daughters, and sent him those damsels in tribute even to the land of our rule." The Maiden tribute is the subject of several ancient ballads by the Christian Spaniards. The following are 2 verses from one of these. "For he who gives the Moorish king 100 maidens of Spain, each year when in the season the day comes round again. If he be not a heathen, he swells the heathen's train. 'Twere better burn a kingdom than suffer such disdain. If the Muslims must have tribute, make men your tribute money. Send idle drones to tease them within their hives of honey. For when 'tis paid with maidens, from every maid there spring some 5 or 6 strong soldiers to serve the Moorish king." Southey also says that the only old Portuguese ballad known to him was on this subject. The evidence, then, of the ballads is strong, for a fact of this kind telling, too, as it does, so much against the writers of the ballads. As to the Christian chroniclers, it is quite true that we find no mention of this tribute in the history of Sebastian of Salamanca and the Chronicle of Abildam, but there is a direct allusion to it in a document included in the collection of Flores. "Our ancestors," says Ramiro, "the kings of the land, we blush to record it, to free themselves from the raids of the Saracens, consented to pay them yearly a shameful tribute of 100 maidens, distinguished for their beauty, 50 of noble birth, and 50 from the people." It was to put an end to this nefarious tribute that Ramiro now ordered a levy en masse. This, if the document is genuine, and Flores gives no hint to the contrary, is good evidence for the fact. Many succeeding writers mention it. Lucas of Tulle says that Ramiro was asked for the tribute in 842. Johannes Vesalius speaks of it as also Alfonso, Bishop of Burgos. And lastly, Rodrigo of Toledo says that Morgatis, 783 to 788, having obtained the throne of Leon by Saracen help, agreed to send this tribute yearly. On the whole, then, the evidence is in favor of the Maiden tribute being no myth, but of its having been regularly paid for more than 50 years. Most of these Christian maidens probably embraced the religion of their husbands, but in some cases they no doubt converted them to their own faith. From different causes, some of which will be mentioned elsewhere, conversions were frequent from one religion to the other. Motives of worldly interest naturally caused the balance in these to fall very much against the Christians, but as the Mohammedan power declined, the opposite was the case. Though voluntary apostasy was, and is, unpardonable, Muhammad seems to have made allowances for those who apostatize under compulsion, for when one of his followers, Ammar ibn Yasir, being tortured by the Quraysh, renounced his belief in God and Muhammad's mission, but afterwards came weeping to the Prophet, Muhammad received him kindly, and, wiping his eyes, said, "What fault was it of thine, if they forced thee?"